So, Julia, really excited to sit down together, and also really appreciate you taking the time out of a very busy day to sit down together as well. It's fantastic to have the opportunity to chat as part of our Strategy Unscripted series, and really just to dig into your expertise and also your insights as well. So maybe to begin with, we know each other. I'm fortunate enough to know you a little bit, but maybe just to begin with, if you could introduce yourself, a little bit about your background, and also your role here.
Sure, happy to. So I am a dad of two young kids. I'm married, live in London. I'm French and British. My career has been half and half in America, half in the UK. In terms of function, I've gravitated around strategy for a long time. Originally, I'm a finance major. Went to business school in my late 20s to transition from finance into strategy, and I've been in the last 25 years in all the functions that neighbor strategy, whether it's business development, partnership strategy, or M&A, or as a board member. So I've been sort of neighboring around that function quite a bit, and I've been sort of anchoring myself into the discipline itself. When people ask me, what do you do for a living? I tend to say, I'm a strategy person. So, and then in terms of experience, I've mostly worked in tech. I came out of college at the time where the internet was sort of invented, so I sort of took that wave all the way. Was very lucky to join 3 companies that ended up being very successful. I joined Amazon in 1999 in Europe. I ended up working for them in America in various roles, mostly operations at the time. I joined Skype pretty early and ended up spending about 6 years with Skype through multiple acquisitions. I had my own startup for 5 years in the messaging space. Then I was at Facebook for about 6 years through the transition to Meta. And last 2 years I've been working for a company called Intuit, which I'm happy to tell you more about. So that's pretty much me professionally.
Fantastic. And from a CV standpoint, or really from an experience standpoint, there's some considerable organizations and some very impressive organizations that you've worked through or worked your way through as well. And I suppose, as you were saying, that the common thread that sits through that is strategy work. But we were just chatting before we started filming about what does strategy actually mean? Because it's a term which is thrown out there with regards to business strategy. We need to be more strategic in how we think. With regards to sport, with regards to life, you work in it. Yeah. For you, what does it mean?
So it's interesting. I mean, we could spend probably several days doing a seminar on what strategy is. I would keep it relatively simple. For me, let me start by what strategy isn't. Strategy is not planning. It's a different thing, and I'll explain why. Strategy is not organizational. That's a different discipline. It started as a different discipline, I think, rightly so. For me, strategy is several things. One is the choice of a path towards a future outcome which you want and your management want and your shareholders want. So it's choosing a destination that you foresee and then laying out the different path and choosing one for logical reasons. And those logical reasons should incorporate many different things. Should incorporate what happens outside with competition and the market and demand. Should encompass what your organization can and cannot do yet. Should encompass the financial reality of the plans and a bunch of other stuff. But it really comes down to choosing out of multiple paths, one path to a desired outcome. And the keyword for me is path, choice, desired outcome, and future. And everything that's not those 4 things, it's something else. It's useful, it adds a lot of value, but it's not strategy per se. If you build a plan for the next 3 months, that is not a strategy. If you build a plan to make your team better, that is not a strategy. If you build a plan to launch a product, that is not a strategy. Those are components of a strategy, but that doesn't define what a strategy team should do. That's sort of my take, and I think academia is relatively in accordance to that.
And just to jump back then to earlier in your career and talk about Skype for a moment, you said that you joined Skype relatively early on in their journey. When you joined, from a strategic plan or an idea of where they ultimately wanted to get to, whether that was 3-year or 5-year, was that something that was very much in place at the time? Was that something that was being built? Was it something that was just inherent that sat behind the work that was happening?
It was interesting. So I think one thing that's specific about doing strategy in tech early like I did, was that for the most part, you're trying to solve problems that had never been dealt with before. So typically, there had never been a piece of software as popular as Skype when Skype started. Never. So you couldn't go anywhere, you couldn't hire anyone to tell you this is the right way to do it, because it had never been done by anybody. And I think that's the case of a lot of large successes in tech. If you look at the platform that Salesforce launched at the time, they were sort of the only one, even in the hardware. And so that's why tech oftentimes is not a great example of strategy, because there's no precedent, there's no benchmarking to do whatsoever. Everything is sort of invented as we speak. The question I was asked to answer at Skype was basically we had an interesting business where the way Skype used to work at the time is basically the more people you are on Skype, the less Skype makes money, because Skype makes money by people going out of network.
Yeah.
So in some ways, the more successful you are, the less successful you are from a business perspective. And we were early in the journey, so it was kind of fun. Those two curves were growing in parallel, but it was an inherent problem. What if you could run Skype on your mobile all the time and have presence and everything? Well, you would never make a Skype count.
You would never have to leave the ecosystem.
You never leave the ecosystem, so you never make any money. And it was hard to say, whoa. Like at some point, the business side of the house needs to marry the tech trajectory, which sounds like it's a very interesting academic problem, but it was a very tactical one, because we wanted to take the company public and build a large business and reward our employees. So that was the main problem we solved, which led to a piece of strategy, which was in a number of years we want to have a business that looks like this. So which businesses can we build that would mirror the usage? So that's kind of how things started, but it was very unique to the case. Oftentimes, you need a strategy to be successful. In that case, we were successful without one, and it had to build one to keep the success sustainable.
I think maybe just to try to distill what you were saying a little bit, it sounds like the strategic work that you did that was inherent across the work at Skype was you had an understanding, or you built an understanding of where you were today, which was a very successful organization, but it had certain constraints. And some of those constraints were internal, because if people stayed in the ecosystem, you're making money. You had a bit of an idea as an organization of where you wanted to get to. We want to go public, we want to be listed, we want to do so and so and so. And the strategic plan was really the bridging, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the bridging of the gap tactically between where you were and where you wanted to be.
I think very much so, and also building the mechanics so that, in some ways we were lucky with the first product. It came out, it came out at a time when bandwidth was rising, so suddenly voice over IP worked.
Yep.
So the usage went like this. But then turning this into a long-term franchise, when you have competition, you have other networks, when telcos are going to launch voice over IP, when competition comes in, when there's price pressure, then we were thrown into the strategy, hot boiler very rapidly, and then sort of our initial competitive advantage was gone. So then we needed a plan, and we actually needed a strategy for this thing to sustain itself.
I mean, it reminds me of a saying, but the only rule or the only consistent is change.
Very much so, yeah.
Everything will change, whether it's product, competition, people learning, consumer behavior, whatever it may be. So I suppose the strategic plan inherently sits below that and supports the navigation of that process. So through your career, as we were saying, you've had varied roles and worked for these different organizations. Were there any very specific challenges that you came across, perhaps even related to people, to the teams, with regards to executing on the strategy?
So yes, and oftentimes, particularly in Silicon Valley, people say, this execution trumps strategy.
It's a pretty common. You see it wheeled out.
And I think it's wrong. Let me explain why. I think a good strategy without enough thought and resources put into execution is useless. It's a nice piece of thinking. It's useful in academic terms, but it doesn't create a dollar or a pound of value. But this being said, fantastic execution without strategic direction is hard to sustain. And I've seen it firsthand when I was at Facebook, which was an incredible machine to build anything. But I would argue at the time we had quite little strategic thinking. We're just better than anybody else at building anything. So something came up that was interesting, we'd build it and then move to the next thing and the next thing. But we rarely made trade-offs also because the business was so profitable that the trade-offs that most companies needed, we didn't have them for the longest time. So to me, that's very much I would say a counterexample. In most cases that I see, the folks building the strategy and the folks executing it tend to be different people, different orgs, different mindset, etc., etc. And to me, unless those two things are done in sync, but also influence each other, so the strategy takes into account what's actually doable, takes into account change management, people's expertise, time zones, like very realistic things, then it's only a piece, it's a goal and a path to get to. But by the same token, if you don't have this and you just hope that people will organically do good things because they're good at their craft, they will keep doing what they do. They might do it a little bit better, they might have a few other ideas, but you can't do big changes this way. I'll give you a very practical example for Skype. Skype ended up building a very successful B2B business, which became Microsoft Teams. Mm-hmm. If we had just kept doing what we were doing, we would be building a consumer thing. We would have emojis in Skype, and we pivoted a business from a consumer business to a B2B business, which doesn't happen. It can never happen organically. It literally means taking people, putting the brakes on and saying, you're going to build something completely different. Now your client is a small SME instead of your mom, and that SME has different security concerns, etc., etc. So if you let companies just execute, even with the best intention and best passion and best ability, they will keep doing what they're doing. So there might be, a dead end coming. They will likely hit it at some point.
So they have the blinders on, and
yeah, because people like doing what they do over and over again. It's comfortable. It's human nature. Versus change is not human nature. Change is hard. Change is painful. It makes people soul. So that's a big element of strategy is making sure that's the idea of the long-term path, if you will.
So it's very, very interesting. If we take into account change as a rule, and we also take into account that change is, if not painful, then it can be uncomfortable or challenging. You chose to do that, if we could dig into this example with Skype. But what were the data-driven, fact-based analysis, or what process did you go through as an organization to build more confidence in the decision that was being taken? Because strategy is about what to do, but it's also just as much about what not to do.
Yes, exactly. So oftentimes what I find is that in the case of Skype, it was interesting because people had the perception that the growth was infinite. 7 billion people would use Skype, mobile would come, it was infinite. And when we actually did the math of the addressable market for Skype out, it was actually very not infinite. There's a set number of calls that are international calls. It's a known market. You compete with people like Libara and the likes. And there's a set number of people who need to call abroad. And there are other services that are emerging like WhatsApp to do IP over IP. So that market you could size, and when you did it, it was actually pretty scary. Like it looked like it was going to go like this and then like this.
Yeah.
So once you've done this mathematically, you can tell people you got a year or 2 years until you have a massive issue. Then change starts to happen. Or at least people don't challenge the why. They get it. Now it's a function of what you're going to do and how you're going to go about doing it. So I think fear is a powerful way to induce change to some extent. In our case, it was quite numerical, and it was a company of engineers, so we had to be logical and data-driven. What I often find is that companies and public ones don't necessarily have the courage to think very, very long term. It's hard. The short term gives you the license to think long term, but if you keep thinking this way, you actually never think long term, or you do when it's too late. So it's striking that balance between doing the things that are right now for this month, for this quarter, for this year, while building enough foundations for the long-term path you choose. Which is why I think having a sustainable strategy that's gets refined, but at least that's long-lasting, is so pivotal, because if you don't have it, basically all you do is managing the next month, which I think most companies do.
And just to shift to a slightly higher level for a moment, in your position, or we think about individuals in C-suite positions, be it the CEO in a large organization or someone else in the C-suite team, they play a pivotal role because they sit between often the board or private equity or investors or the market, and they also sit between the rest of the organization below. And they need to signal to them, this is the strategic plan, there's confidence in it, this is what we're doing. In that particular role or sitting in that type of seat, what are the key challenges or the key pains that those individuals face with regards to building, executing, monitoring, communicating the organization strategy?
I think it's hard, because in some ways, I think a very good head of strategy in a large company, or even in a small one, is someone that I see as a catalyst. So your job is not to do, and your job is not to advise. Your job is exactly in between. So part of it is advising and convincing and rallying people around an idea or a plan or a piece of change that you want to do. And part of it is making sure that this thing will actually be accepted and built upon, and then refine it. So to be a good catalyst, you need to be in between all those things at the same time. So you need to be able to sell, you need to be able to convince people by very different ways, by fear, by numbers, by empathy, by excitement, sometimes by technology. You need to be able to use all those, because a catalyst needs to convince a lot of different people at the same time. But by the same token, you need to be a great storyteller, because only a good story is remembered and sticks. And you also need to be a good analyst, because there's a lot of data that gets into doing it. So for me, that's why I think people who are good in strategy and stay in strategy for long tend to be generalists. I think I'm a good example of this, because I grew up as a finance person. I find interest in operations. I like to sell. I like people management. I sort of like the whole chapters of the business books. And I end up in strategy because I can sort of touch it all. That's sort of the way I think.
What strikes me, and correct me if I'm wrong, and it's just my viewpoint on it, but it almost seems like strategy work within organizations is an area that oftentimes people think they know the most about. They know what strategy is, we build the strategy, but at the same time, they have the least visibility or understanding of actually implementing. Because when we discuss it like this, there are so many different components that go into it. We can just say that the strategy is the strategic plan, and it's that PowerPoint, it sits on the desk, this is what we're doing, that's our strategy. But actually it isn't. The strategy may start with that, it may start with a PowerPoint or on a platform, but actually the true core of the strategy itself is how you're able to cascade it down through an organization, make it permeate, make people believe in it, make people align behind it, so that they want to go and execute and contribute.
Yeah, I think it's very true. I think there's two things you said which are really pivotal. One is people tend to explain the output of strategy. So we went through strategic exercise and we decided to do those three things. Focus on that market, that product, etc. And they explain this. And if you're an engineer or a salesperson and you've been told this, but nothing about the why, I just don't think it works. I think people are smart and they need to understand the why you're telling them you're going to sell that product over that one, why price is going to go up or down. And to me, the exercise of explaining the why is pretty fundamental. And I think a good piece of strategy explains the outcome, but also the why and the choices you make. Every decision to do something is a decision to not do something else. And I think every time when you take people through those trade-offs and speak to their intelligence at any level, I think that's when you get a better chance of getting buy-in across functions, sales, marketing, product, whatever. And people tend to just super simplify the output and say, we put posters everywhere, those are the three things we're going to do. Remember, and anyone needs to remember them. And to me, if you spend a little bit of time arming the managers to explain why you're doing those things, then you're likely to have people say, I get it, it makes sense, and I'm now on board. Because I think logic is a powerful to explain strategy. But at the same token, there has to be an element of believability. It's a path that we can actually get on. So it's doable, It's not just wonderful if we get there and we hope for the best. It has a decent chance of happening. So it's the balance between explaining why you're doing this, but also explaining that it can actually be done by us all together. And those two things, it's rare that people do those two things. Consultants are very good at explaining the why to senior management, but leave it upon them to explain this to everybody else. And then leadership tends to be very good at sort of saying, repeating the three things we're going to do, but not really explaining why. And ultimately, for me, strategy is about decision making. Decision making is about choosing something over something else. It's pretty simple, but when I see companies saying we have 17 strategic priorities, I get completely puzzled. Because to me, having more than 3 or 4
challenging.
It's really hard for anyone to rally around and just get done.
And to communicate and cascade it down and engage the team, more difficult today, easier today, or just different to how it was, for example, 20 years ago? Because I'm thinking that today, from a technological standpoint, we have all the tools and platforms and the ability to speak to each other like that. 20 years ago, not as much, but at the same time, that brings challenges.
Yeah. I have mixed views on this. To me, oftentimes a piece of strategy that's well done induces some complexity. It can't be dumbed down into a 30-second video. I don't think so. You can't, if you run Shell, if you run, I don't know, any large companies, or the ATP, or if you want to explain why you're doing what you're doing, it takes a bit of time. So for me, the idea that people should focus and read through something, and you can really take them through, whatever the format. It could be a video, it could be an email, it could be a text, it could be an audio message. But something that requires attention and focus that people can understand, can follow your logic, which means it is not a TikTok, or it is not like, a Zoom call where people barely pay attention.
Yeah.
It's something I like the idea of a small booklet. People refer back to, and that's how they sort of memorize and get familiar with. And also, I think the key element is that what I think Intuit does well, for example, is that our strategy, if you look at our strategy that our CEO Sasan laid out 5 years ago when he joined, and now, it has evolved, but it's pretty much the same thing. And as far as I can tell, most very successful companies I've seen, at least in my space in technology, have built really franchises, and Intuit was started 40 years ago, have had a pretty sustainable way to think about their strategy. And they amend them a little bit, but there's not a new strategy every 3 months.
Core pillars almost.
Yeah, it's the direction. You can't say 1 year I'm going here and the next year I'm going completely here, and expect that over 3 or 4 years you'll be successful. You might say I'm going to go there, and then the next year you might say actually I'm going to go a little bit slower or faster. But I think the stability of the vision gives time to people to actually get it done, but also change plans, change the how, change the people, if they need to, add more money to something or less, put less money to something else. But you need to stay the course to some extent. It's the same way in government. A government that has 2 mandates is more likely to be successful than a government that has 1. I think the same applies. And what has changed over the years, I think there's just more noise. So people feel like they know, but they don't, because they know bits. But for example, if you look at the success of some media, specifically on strategy, like Strategy, for example, in tech, it's a blog post. It's a blog that's been very successful. It really serves that purpose of like, if I work in strategy and I want to spend an hour thinking about a company, I'm interested in how Musk is going to fix Twitter, then I'm happy to go through a 6-page article and actually take 20 minutes to read it. And I think there's something profound about, can we get people to actually pay attention and go through the details in their own time, and then they will memorize it and be more likely to execute it. That's my view. Some have different views, but like some mediums are very well suited for this, some aren't.
Yeah. And I don't want to take too much of your time because I know also you've got a very busy day today, but just as a last question, we spoke then just about core pillars or the foundations for an organization. just interested to know, are there any core pillars for you as an individual, or having worked, as you said, within Amazon and Skype and others, any core pillars to the work that you do that you really try to stay true to, or you try to implement, as well as with the teams that you work with?
Yeah, I'd say that for me there are three things fundamentally when I think about how to help my companies and even my teams be successful. I think one is having a clear directional view of where we want to go. So every year, I always refine, in 3 years we want to be like this. And I do the exercise every year as I start the year, because that's the only way I can really lead. So one is the direction. I'd say the second is thinking about the people you have, their talents, their motivation, how they're organized. But companies are groups of people who do things together. And you may have the best strategy, the best technology. If you don't get along and can work efficiently together, it will not work. At some point it will break. So strategy is having the direction, having a sense of, do I have the right people, to have enough of them, and do they work well together? And third is what I call sort of resource utilization. Cash, time, people. Am I using them efficiently? Are they on the right things? And I tend to default to those three things. If the three things are done well as a practice, like you go to the gym, you do them every 3 months, every 6 months, every year, I find that teams and org tend to function well over the long run. The rest can be a little bit noise. You can win a client, you can lose a client. It's okay. There'll be another client to find. I'm not saying it's not important, but I'm saying, as I try to lead, those three things are really my pillar. And if one of them is broken, I'll fix it. Yep. If we overspend, or we don't have good control over our time or our resources or our money, then I will spend a huge amount of time to make sure we can monitor it. If we don't have the right people, or they're not good enough, or they don't work well enough together, I'll fix it. And if the strategy and direction is not clear, I'll make it clear. And I'm obsessive about getting those three things to work. The rest is pretty much secondary in my way of thinking.
I believe what touched me, or I'm most interested in, as part of what you just said, and I believe is most poignant, is the fact that we could pick up and take what you said, and we can apply it to Intuit. We can apply it in the past to Amazon. We could apply it to a football team. We could apply it to a manufacturing company. We could apply it to individuals that are trying to climb Everest. Ultimately, they're fundamental pillars and fundamental ethos and values to enable individuals and teams and organizations to get from where they are today to where they want to be very effectively. And I just think it's interesting that we could apply that across a variety of industries and completely different walks of life as well.
Yeah, and a lot of my learning is done personally outside of business. In sports, in literature, in arts. I think the arts of doing great things as a group of people is the same. Yeah. Business happens to have a currency of success, which is money. In other forms, it could be success, it could be medals, it could be championship, whatever. But I think the mechanics are pretty much universal.
Well, Julien, look, really appreciate your time, really appreciate your insight and your expertise as well. So thank you for that, and look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Thank you, Julien.